The last thing my mother said to me before she died was not goodbye. It was not I love you, though she did, fiercely, and in the specific way. Yoruba mothers who show love through action and correction, and the precise calibrated pressure of high expectations. It was not be careful, or come home soon, or the name of the man she had been praying I would find since I turned 27 and became, in her private estimation, dangerously close to choosing work over everything else. The last thing my mother said to me was, "See me. Do not let them make you small." I was 31 years old. I had a first-class degree from the University of Lagos, a master's from the London School of Economics, and a career in international hospitality management that had taken me from Abuja to Dubai to Singapore. I had sat in rooms with ministers and CEOs and once, memorably, with a former head of state who asked my opinion on regional infrastructure funding, and then looked genuinely startled when I gave it. Nobody had ever made me small. Then I went to Busan, South Korea. On the 14th morning of a contract I had taken for reasons I did not fully understand yet, reasons I told myself were professional, but which I now know were grief wearing the costume of ambition. A man in a charcoal suit walked into the service corridor of the Grand Marais Hotel and looked at me the way people look at furniture. Useful, inanimate, correctly placed. He said, "You missed a section. Do it again. And tell your supervisor that staff uniforms are not a suggestion." My name badge said, "See me. Just see me." No surname. His name was Hajun Yul. His family owned the building we were standing in. He did not know my surname either. That was the first mistake. The second was assuming that a woman holding a mop had nothing behind her eyes worth looking at. I looked at him for a long moment. The kind of long that is not rudeness. That is the specific, unhurried, completely unintimidated measurement of a person who has decided something. Then I said, in Korean, "The section is not missed. The section is drying. If you walk through it now, you will damage the finish and I will have to begin again, which will inconvenience both of us. I would suggest the East Corridor." He stared at me. I indicated the East Corridor. Hajun Yul, heir to the Yul Group, 36 years old, the most powerful name in Korean luxury hospitality, took the East Corridor. That was the morning everything began. But before I tell you what came after, before I tell you about the elevator and the amber light, and the conversation that cracked us both open, and the journey I did not expect to make, I need to tell you about my mother, because she is where this story actually starts. Not in Busan, in Ibadan, in a hospital room that smelled of antiseptic, and the frangipani my aunt kept bringing because she believed in the power of beautiful things to hold space against terrible ones. My mother said, "Do not let them make you small." And I said, "Mummy, nobody makes me anything." She smiled. The way she smiled when I had said something she found simultaneously correct and completely beside the point. 3 days later she was gone. And 6 weeks after that I was in Busan, mopping floors, trying to understand what she had actually meant. If this is your first time here, subscribe right now. Every story on this channel is built from a real place. That is the only kind worth making. Subscribe and stay with me. I should explain how a woman with my CV ends up in a housekeeping uniform in a 5-star hotel in Busan. The short version is, I applied. The longer version, the true version, is that 3 weeks after my mother's funeral, I was sitting in my apartment in Singapore, surrounded by the infrastructure of a life I had built with tremendous precision and almost no emotional content. And I realized I could not spend one more day in a city that had no memory of her. Singapore did not know she had existed. My office did not know she had existed, except as a line in a bereavement leave form. The city went about its business with the complete indifference of a place that is very good at business. And I sat in my apartment and felt the specific, suffocating wrongness of grief that has nowhere to land. My mother had spent 23 years in the hospitality industry, not management operations. She was a housekeeper, then a head housekeeper, then a floor supervisor at the Abadan Continental. She used to say, "Simi, I learned more about people from cleaning their rooms than most psychiatrists learn in a lifetime. A room tells you everything. How someone treats a space they do not own tells you who they actually are." I had heard this my entire childhood. I had filed it next to her other wisdoms and gone on to build a career in which I managed the people who managed the rooms, from a glass office with a view. After she died, I wanted to understand what she had seen. That is the truth. That is the reason I applied for a 6-week housekeeping contract at the Grand Marais Hotel in Busan, South Korea, under my middle name and my mother's maiden name, Simi Adekunle, with a CV that listed only my operational experience and omitted the management roles, the London degree, the Dubai contracts worth more than most annual budgets. I wanted to clean rooms. I wanted to see what she had seen. I wanted to be, for 6 weeks, in the work that had formed her. Because she was gone. And that work was the closest thing to a conversation with her that remained available to me. My friend Kemi, who is the most practical person I have ever met, and who compensates for her practicality with an extremely sharp tongue, sighed. "Simi, you have lost your mind with grief, and I say that with love. You are going to South Korea to mop floors because your mother mopped floors in Ibadan. Your mother would think this was insane," I said. "My mother would understand completely." Kemi said, "Your mother would tell you to go to therapy." She was probably not wrong. But I bought the ticket anyway. The Grand Marais Hotel in Busan is 42 floors of glass and pale stone on the edge of Haeundae Beach. The kind of building that looks, from a distance, like someone tried to distill the idea of luxury into an architectural form. The Yul Group owns 7 hotels across Korea and 3 in Japan. And the Busan property is the flagship, the one the family points to when they want to explain who they are. I had researched the Yul family the way I research everything. Completely and without mercy. The patriarch was Yul Daesik, 71, semi-retired, legendary in Korean hospitality circles for building the group from a single guest house in Jeongju in the 1980s. His son, Hajun, had taken operational control 4 years ago after a succession process that the Korean business press had described, with considerable tact, as complicated. Hajunin was 36. He had a reputation for exacting standards, a schedule that began before most people's alarms went off, and a management style that his staff described, when they described it at all, which was carefully, as demanding. I knew all of this before I arrived. What I did not know was that on the 14th morning he would walk into the service corridor on the 23rd floor at 6 a.m. carrying coffee he hadn't drunk, and looking like a man who had not slept with any conviction in longer than he would admit, and that he would look at me, not at my face but at a category of me, and tell me I had missed a section, and that something in the way I corrected him would stop him in that corridor for 4 full seconds before he took the east corridor without another word. My mother used to say that a room tells you everything about a person. So does a corridor. He came back the next morning. Not to apologize. I want to be precise about that, because it would be easy to tell this story as though the apology came immediately, and everything that followed was warm and inevitable. It was not like that. He came back because the Grand Marais Hotel's 23rd floor service corridor was on his inspection route, and Hajun Yul did not alter inspection routes for any reason, including the mild social discomfort of encountering a housekeeper who had corrected his assessment of a floor finish the previous morning. He arrived at 5:58 a.m. I was already working. He inspected the east end of the corridor. then the West End. Then he stopped at the section I had been mopping when he arrived and looked at it for a moment. He said, "The finish is better today." I said, "I know. I changed the solution ratio yesterday afternoon. The supplier changed their formula in March and nobody updated the dilution guide." He said, "How did you know the formula had changed?" I said, "I read the product documentation. It is on the supplier's website. Your procurement team may not have caught it." He looked at me with the specific expression of a man recalibrating something. Not warmly. Recalibration is not a warm process, but with genuine attention, which was different from the previous morning, and which I noticed the way you notice a change in pressure before weather arrives. He said, "I'll have someone check." He left. The next morning he came back again. This became the pattern of the following 2 weeks. I want to describe it accurately, because it was nothing like what it sounds like from the outside. It was not romantic. It was not even, initially, friendly. It was 2 people occupying the same corridor at the same early hour. One of them doing a job, and one of them inspecting it, and a series of exchanges that began as corrections and became, slowly and without either of us deciding this was happening, something closer to conversation. He told me, on the 4th morning, that the East Corridor's grout was cracking at the northern end, and that maintenance had been scheduled 3 times and cancelled twice. I told him that the cleaning trolley wheels were leaving marks on the skirting boards on the west side, and that the wheel size had been wrong since the last equipment order, and that whoever signed off on that order had not consulted the floor staff. He said, "Do you always notice things like this?" I said, "I was raised to notice things like this." He said, "By who?" I paused. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, Bizan was beginning to define itself against an early morning sky. The harbour catching the first light, the container ships patient and enormous in the distance, the city doing the slow, reliable work of becoming daytime. I said, "My mother. She was in housekeeping for 23 years. She believed that the quality of attention you bring to a space is a form of respect for the people who will use it." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "My grandfather built this hotel's first property with 4 rooms and 2 staff. He cleaned the rooms himself for the first 3 years. My father watched him. I have never cleaned a room in my life." It was the most personal thing he had said to me. It arrived without warning, in the same flat, controlled tone he used for everything, which made it more rather than less significant. The way a crack in a perfectly engineered surface is more alarming precisely because the surface was perfect. I said, "Does that bother you?" He said, "I don't know. I haven't thought about it enough to know." I said, "That might be the answer." He looked at me, and for the first time I had the sense that Hajun, Yal, was not looking at the category of me, but at me specifically. At Simi Adekonli. Then his phone rang. He answered it and walked away, the professional frame closing over him like water. I finished the corridor. I thought about my mother. She would have found this both completely logical and extremely funny. I could almost hear her laughing. My contract was 6 weeks. By week 4 I had stopped counting. This is the part I have to tell carefully, because it is the part where I was most wrong. Not dramatically wrong, not in a way that makes a good confrontation scene, but in the quiet, accumulated way of a person who is making a choice without fully admitting it to themselves. The work had become something I did not want to put down, not because I had discovered a vocation for housekeeping, though. I want to say clearly that the skill and standard required are far more than people who have not done it will ever understand. And my mother was right that it teaches you things no boardroom will. But because the work required my complete presence, every morning at 5 I arrived and the floor required everything I had. Attention, precision, physical effort. And for those hours I was not a daughter whose mother had died. I was not an executive contemplating a future that had to be built without the person who had been its scaffolding. I was not the grief that had been sitting in my chest since Ibadan like something with weight and temperature. I was just Simi, working. Present. It was the first time since the funeral that I had been fully present anywhere. I extended the contract without telling Kemi. She would have had things to say that were accurate, and that I was not ready to hear. I told myself it was because the job was unfinished. There was a systematic issue with the floor care products on levels 20 through 25 I had identified and was tracking. Which was true. But it was not the reason. The reason was that going home meant the grief would be waiting at full size. Here in Bizen, in a uniform that was not mine, the grief was somehow smaller. Or I was somehow larger than it. The distance between myself and everything that knew me by name had created enough space to breathe. Hajun and I had, by this point, become something the hotel had not planned for. Hotels plan for everything. Every relationship inside them has a name, a protocol, a correct distance. Guest and staff, owner and employee. We had slipped between all of those categories without deciding to. The way water finds the gap a builder did not account for. He told me, on a Tuesday in the 5th week, that his father had asked him to open a new property in Jeju, and that he did not want to. I asked why. He said, because Jeju is my father's idea of what comes next, not mine. I said, what is your idea of what comes next? He looked out the corridor window at the harbour below. He said, I'm not sure I have been allowed to develop one. I understood that. I understood it because I had spent my entire career being excellent at things that were, in some sense, pre-approved. The degrees my mother was proud of. The positions that confirmed what she had believed about me. We were, I realized, versions of the same problem approached from opposite ends. He had too much structure and not enough self. I had too much self and had been using it to outrun the things I did not want to feel. I did not say this to him, but I thought it, and the thinking of it was the beginning of something I could not yet name. On a Thursday evening, I had stayed late, later than my shift required, because one of the floor buffers had developed an uneven rotation that was leaving faint arcs on the marble, and I wanted to identify the cause before I logged off. It was the kind of thing that did not need to be my problem, and which I could not leave alone, which is a trait I inherited from my mother. It was past 9 when I finished. The 23rd floor was empty. The day staff long gone. I took the service elevator down. It stopped between the 23rd and 24th floors with a sound that was not dramatic. Not the lurch of a disaster movie. Nothing that announced itself as significant. A soft mechanical hesitation. A click. And then stillness, and the specific quality of silence that belongs to a stopped elevator, which is different from any other silence because it is surrounded by the awareness of space in every direction. The emergency lighting came on. Amber. Dim enough to soften everything. I pressed the call button. A recorded voice told me, in Korean, that my call had been registered, that maintenance had been notified, and that I should remain calm and wait. I was calm. I pressed the intercom. The voice that answered was not the front desk. It was Hajun. He said, "Which elevator?" I said, "Service. Between 23 and 24. A pause. Then, "I know this elevator. The cable tension sensor has been flagged twice. I'll call engineering." I said, "Thank you." He said, "It may take 40 minutes. The senior engineer is off-site." I said, "I understand." Another pause. Longer. Then, "I'm coming down." I said, "That isn't necessary." He said, "I know." The intercom clicked off. I sat down on the mop cart, not comfortable but better than the floor, and waited. 12 minutes later the intercom crackled. Hajin said. I'm on 23. The engineer estimates 35 minutes. Are you all right? I said. I'm fine. You don't have to stay. He said. I know. He stayed. We talked through the intercom for the first 20 minutes. After a while, he said, You stayed late tonight. I said, The buffer on 23 has an uneven rotation. I wanted to find the cause. He said, You have been finding causes since you arrived. I said, It is what I do. He said, It is more than that. The way you move through this building, it is not how a housekeeper moves. I have managed housekeeping staff for 8 years. I noticed on the third morning. I said, What did you think? He said, I thought you were someone who had been in management and had chosen to step back. Some people do that. Burnout or personal reasons. I did not ask because it was not my business, and because whatever your reason, the work was being done at a standard I have not seen on that floor in 3 years. I said, I should have told you. He said, Told me what? And there it was. The question with its door open. I looked at the amber walls. I thought about my mother. I thought about the 6 weeks I had spent in her work, learning what she had seen, and whether I had found it, and whether I had also found something I had not been looking for and did not know what to do with. I said, My name is Simi Adekonli. I am the Senior Director of Hospitality Operations for the Meridian Group, East Africa and Southeast Asia. Before that, Kempinski Dubai. Before that, London School of Economics. I took this contract under my middle name and my mother's maiden name because I needed to be someone without a title for a while. Not to deceive you, because my mother died in March and she spent 23 years doing this work, and I needed to understand it from the inside before I lost the only reason I had ever wanted to understand it at all. Silence. Not the comfortable kind. The kind that is doing something. Then Hajin said, The supplier formula. You knew immediately, I said. Management experience. And my mother taught me to read product documentation, the way other mothers taught their children to read recipes. He said, The grout on 21, the buffer tonight. I said, Yes. He said, Why are you still here? Your contract was 6 weeks. And this was the question I had not fully answered, even for myself. I held it for a moment in the amber stillness of a stopped elevator between 2 floors with nowhere to go and no role to hide behind. I said, Because going home means she is fully gone. Here, nobody knows what I have lost, which means in some way I have not lost it yet. I know how that sounds. He said, It sounds like the truest thing you have said since you arrived. I said, Probably. He said, My grandfather died 4 years ago. The week after he died, I came to this hotel, and I inspected every floor, every room, every corridor. My operations director thought I was conducting a performance review. I was not. I was looking for something he had left in the building, some trace of the person who had built it before my father extended it, and before I inherited it. I did not find it, but I kept looking. I am still looking. I said, Did you ever think that maybe you don't find it? That maybe you build something new, and that becomes the trace you leave? He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, No, I have not thought that. Not once in 4 years. I said, Think about it now. You have time. The engineer is still 30 minutes away. He made a sound that was almost a laugh. The first I had heard from him. We stayed like that. Him on the 23rd floor on the other side of a steel door, me in an amber-lit box suspended between floors, the hotel moving quietly around both of us. At some point he said, When the engineer comes. After. Will you tell me about her? Your mother. I said, Yes. He said, I would like to know what she saw. In 23 years. I said, I am still working that out myself. But what I have so far, I'll tell you all of it. The engineer arrived in 31 minutes. The elevator resumed with the same undramatic click with which it had stopped. When the doors opened on the 23rd floor, Ha-jun was standing there, not with relief on his face, not with the managed expression he wore during the building's professional hours. Just present, looking at me the way he had been looking at me for weeks, but without the frame around it now, without any of the architecture that the hotel required of both of us. He said, "There is a 24-hour Poyangmatcha 2 streets from the east entrance. They have doenjang jjigae that my grandfather apparently ate every Sunday morning. I have never tried it." I said, "Then we should go." He said yes. We went. And I told him about my mother. All of it. Not the managed version, but the true version. Over a pot of soup that tasted, in the way that the best food does, like someone had put something of themselves into the making of it. The kind of thing she would have noticed immediately. The kind of thing I was learning, finally, to notice too. The formal discovery came on a Friday. Not from me. I had been building toward telling him properly, rehearsing the shape of it. But his operations director ran a standard background check on contract staff that week, typed my middle name and my mother's maiden name into the industry database, and found on the first page of results 3 years of conference speaking credits, a feature in African Hospitality Review, titled The Next Generation of African Luxury Management, and a photograph that was recognizably me. He brought it to Ha-jun on a Friday morning. Ha-jun came to the 23rd floor at 6:15. 15 minutes later than usual. I noticed the 15 minutes before I saw his face. He stood at the end of the corridor with a tablet under his arm. He looked at me for a moment. He said, "Simi Adekunle, Senior Director of Hospitality Operations, East Africa and Southeast Asia. Meridian Group. 4 years. Before that, Kempinski Dubai. Before that, the London School of Economics." I put down the mop handle carefully. I said, "Yes." He said, "You told me in the elevator." I said, "Yes." He said, "And you are telling me again now." I said, "I am not telling you again. I am confirming that what I told you in the elevator was the whole truth, and not a version of it." He looked at me. He said, "I know. I understood that in the elevator. I came this morning because I wanted to see if it changed anything. The way you work. The way you move through this corridor." I said, "And?" He said, "It doesn't. You are the same person you were yesterday." I said, "I have been the same person since I arrived. The title is different. The person is the same." He nodded. He looked at the corridor, the specific quality of a floor that has been properly cared for. Then he said, "The grout on 21 has been scheduled for repair." "Next week," I said. "I know. I saw the maintenance order this morning." He said, "You checked the maintenance log?" I said, "I check it every morning." "Old habit." He said, "I've been thinking about what you said in the elevator." I said, "Which part?" He said, "That maybe you don't find what someone left behind. Maybe you build something new, and that becomes the trace." I have been thinking about it since Thursday. I think you are right. I said, "Your grandfather would probably agree." He said, "I think so too." He tucked the tablet under his arm. He looked at me one more time with the specific directness that had replaced, over 7 weeks, the category glance of the first morning. Then he said, "The Poyangmatcha opens at midnight. If you are still here." I said, "I'll be here." He nodded and walked back toward the private elevator. I stood in the corridor for a moment. Then I picked up the mop, and I finished the floor. I went home to Lagos in the 8th week. Not because the contract ended. I had long since stopped being bound by the contract. I went home because Kemi called on a Sunday and said nothing for a moment when I answered, which is the only thing Kemi does that means she is frightened. And I asked what was wrong, and she said, "Nothing is wrong. I just miss you." And I realized that I had been using Busan the way I had used everything since March, as a place to put the grief so I did not have to hold it in my own hands. My mother's room in our family house in Lagos was the same. My aunt had kept it. I had known this and had not been ready to enter it since the funeral. I entered it the evening I came home. I sat on the edge of her bed and looked at the things she had kept. The photograph from her first year at the Ibadan Continental, young and laughing and already entirely herself. The small notebook where she had recorded, in her careful handwriting, the names of every guest she remembered who had been kind. The bottle of hand cream that still smelled like her. I stayed in that room for a long time. I told her about the Grand Marais, about the 23rd floor and the East Corridor, and the supply of formula and the grout on 21. I told her about the elevator and the amber light, and Hachun's voice through the intercom and the Poyang matcha, and the soup that tasted like someone had put something of themselves into the making of it. I told her she had been right. That a room tells you everything about a person. That the work teaches things the office cannot. That attention is a form of love and I had learned to give it. In Busan. In the spirit of what she had worn for 23 years. I told her I was not small. I had never been small. But now I knew it in my body rather than just my mind. Hajun sent me a photograph 2 months later. The Jeongju guest house. His grandfather's original property, which the Yule Group had been using as storage for decades, and which Hajun has begun renovating, not as a hotel, as a record, a kept place. He said in the message, "I think this is where I start." I wrote back, "Your grandfather would understand that." He wrote, "I hope so." I wrote, "He would." And so would my mother. Now let me ask you something before this story ends. And I want you to actually think about it. What is the thing you have been putting off feeling because you are too busy achieving? Sit with that. Because that is what this story is really about. Not the corridor. Not the elevator. Not the man who finally learned to see. It is about the woman who had to stop running before she could find out what she was running toward. She asked me not to let them make me small. What she was really asking, what I understand now, in the way you understand things that arrive late, but arrive completely, was for me to know the size of myself. Not the title, not the degree, not the career that confirmed what she had always believed about me. The size of the attention I was capable of giving. The size of the love. She knew that size. She had been demonstrating it for 23 years in rooms that were not hers, for people whose names she wrote in a small notebook because she thought kindness deserved to be remembered. I know it now, and I carry it the way she carried it. In my hands, in my body, in the specific, unhurried attention of a woman who has learned that the most powerful thing you can do in any room, any corridor, any amber-lit elevator suspended between floors, is see it fully, and see the people inside it, the way my mother always did, the way I am learning, finally, to do. If this story reached something in you, like this video and subscribe. We build every story here from a real place, with real emotion, for people who believe that the most powerful response to being unseen is simply, and completely, to refuse. Thank you for staying until the end.